Hello architects and welcome back to another RPG Architect tutorial. My name is Bert and today we have something pretty special for you. The one and only Rikyu has put together a complete, fully comprehensive battle system tutorial. He takes you from start to finish on creating a very cool, kind of like a Breath of Fire 3 isometric style battle system. It's really great, and we had some internal discussion on if we should wait till after I was done with my tutorial series to post it, but we kind of all agreed that it would be better just to get this info out there, because I know you guys need a full battle system tutorial, and the way that I teach things, let's be real, it's gonna take a while. This intro is taking a while. Anyway, don't worry, I'm still going to complete my battle system tutorial. It's going to be a different style than what Rikyu does, but like I said, we just wanted to get this out so you guys could get just rocking and rolling on your battle systems and creating your games. Also, don't worry that it says advanced battle system. Even if you've never done any of the battle system stuff before, he teaches it really well, and so just check it out, watch it, you'll pick up some stuff, I guarantee it, and then, if you can always go back and rewatch sections, and like I said, I'm going to be putting out my tutorial videos here soon, so don't be afraid of the word advanced. You guys got this. If I can follow it and watch it and learn things, then you can, okay? And if you check the description of this video, you can find instructions on how to download the reference project. This will help you guys follow along. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Rikyu, and I hope you enjoy.
Hello architects! In this video series we will learn how to create a battle system from scratch. You should be familiar with the engine already, in order to follow along. First we will start off with setting up a new project for our battle system. After that we will dive into the building blocks we have inside RPGArchitect. We will learn how to set up a background correctly and how to define the characters for the battle system. Then we will create a formation for the enemies we are going to fight against. After that we will focus on the user interface of the battle commands, like how to create UI elements for visual representation of the skills and the navigation of the menus. Then we will learn how to create skills next, and then how to create statistics for our characters. After that we will dive into animations, like how to create a cursor animation for the targets, before we dive into visual effects for the skills. Then we are going to learn how to create battle poses and use them for our action sequences. This section is dedicated to our characters' actions inside battle. Next we will create a battle overlay with portraits and statistics for our characters. Then after that we are finishing up the skills we have created. After we will learn about status effects that can occur, like when enemies or heroes are defeated, or when using buffs to change the attributes. Then we will learn about formulas, and what functions and mathematical operations can be used to further customize your formulas. Then we will learn how to create the AI of the enemy. And after that, we will wrap it up and take a look at the building blocks we have in RPGArchitect that we can use to build any kind of RPG battle system. Let's get started. I have created a completely new project and I have changed some settings. The first was I've added a tileset to the database, which I defined as flat tileset. But you can go with either terraforming or structure tilesets to build your map. We will just have one of 3 maps filled with tiles, so we have something to work on. Then I changed the scaling inside the video configuration to 0.25. You don't need to do this if your tiles are rendered properly inside the engine. Since my tiles are working with 128 x 128 pixels, I had to adjust the scale a bit. So if your tiles are the same in size or larger, then you will need to change your scaling in order to be able to render properly inside the engine. We will be creating a 3D project with 2D sprites for the characters, in a similar style like Breath of Fire 4. So the reference will be a Breath of Fire 4 battle system style. These are the video settings for the project. Then I've added an icon sheet inside the General tab and adjusted the size of those accordingly, since the icons are also 128 pixels. However, icons don't need to be the same size as your tiles. You could just have them in any size you want, but you could go with 16, 32, 48, 256 or whatever size your icons should be. So the icons will be used later on to set up skills or items, for example. Be sure that skip title is enabled, since we will not use a title in this video. As for the virtual keys, I've mapped the WASD keys to the controls. These were the only things I added after I've created a new project inside the database. Next, let's go to the editor. Here I've created 3 maps. The first one I renamed to World doesn't really contain anything besides it acts as a container for 2 other maps. The second one I renamed to Encounter, since this will be the map where we will walk on and encounter enemies to start the battle. Also, I set the starting position on this map. The next map is renamed to Battlefield. This will be the environment where the battle occurs. I also changed the camera distance of the encounter map to 4 and the yaw to 270. So for now, let's select the encounter map, fill it in with some tiles and save it Ctrl S. Back to the database, let's add the player character. Resize the character slots to the amount we need and set the name, the portrait. If you don't want to type everything in, use the autofit buttons. A sprite or model, in this case I will go with sprite. Then set the battle sprites or model for the character. These are the ones that appear in battle. If it's a sprite, select the pose that should be the idle pose while in battle. That's the pose where the character is just staying in place in his battle position. After I modeled all the characters, I rendered them in sprites and made for this example 6 different poses, with 8 frames each. Since my sheets are not oriented around the center frame, I deactivated it on both sprite sheets. Then you can set the collider for the character. The collider setup is for the on-map collision, since I want the battle to start when I collide with another character. Right now the character is using the animation that is set here for walking. Let's add an idle animation to the character. This will occur when the character is not moving around. For that, go to Character Animations, resize the list as before. Set the animation name, in this case that will be an idle animation. Set it to cycle the animation, the frame duration you want to go with, and then click on Edit and choose the animation that represents your idle animation. In my case, the idle animation is the left one. The right one is used for the walking sprite, which I've set up just before. It is important to understand how character animations work inside RPGArchitect. What you select here is just a template. So when you select any character from the dropdown, which is a sprite sheet from another character, that sprite sheet won't replace the one you assigned inside the characters tab. What matters is the offset down here. So whatever is set here, for example right now it's set to 0 since I'm using the very first sprites on the sheet, will be taken into account when the engine is looking for the position of your sheet. So that's the reason why I renamed the idle animation to Hero Idle instead of Eric Idle, for example, since I can't assign this idle animation to any hero. So again, the frame offset is what the engine's looking for when you change your sprite animations. Back to the characters and then select the idle animation for the hero. Then switch to the New Game tab and add the hero to the party and playtest. Now let's set up the entity that will make the battle start once the player collides with it. Set the sprites for the entity the same way as for the character and make the animation to cycle through the frames. And the interaction to player on entity touch. Then add a script with right click, under battle, start battle. Once we added the script to start the battle, we will need to select the enemy formation and the battle backdrop for the script. That's what we have to create next. Confirm and go back to the database. Under the enemies tab is where we create enemies for our battle system. Resize the list like we did before, and same as for the character sprites, set the name, the portrait and battle sprite. The Goblin Mage entity in the editor is solely made to start the battle on collision in-game. The enemies inside the database, however, are the ones you will encounter in battle. Next, we would need to create enemy formations, but we don't have a background yet to place them on, so let's make the background next. Under the Backgrounds tab, resize as always the list and name the background. I will set the same name as for the map in the editor. Then add an enemy position. Right now we can choose a map as the background and the battle system is configured to use an interface background. But we want to create a 3D one that occurs on an external map. For that, go to Configuration under Battles, then set Occurs on External Map. Then go back to the backgrounds and now we can select it. However, since we changed the battle system to occur on the external map, we can't see the enemy position anymore, and that's because we have to place a focal point on the map. Confirm everything and go back to the editor. Select the focal point mode and place it somewhere on the map. The camera will be centered around that focal point when the battle starts. Save everything with Ctrl+S so the change will be recognized in the database. Then under background we can now see the enemy's position, but also we can see the coordinates of the focal point right next to the battlefield map. As for the background of the battlefield map, we could go back to the editor and fill it with tiles, and this will also work great. But I want to demonstrate that we can also have a 3D model as background. For that I will use a plane with a grass texture and assign to a doodad and use it as the background for the battlefield. Go to the doodads tab, resize like always, set the name for the model, create a new category, select the model in the sprite model selector, set the shape to flat Y-plane, and set the visual that fits your model. Confirm, then go back to the editor, select Doodad Selection Mode, and select the doodad from the category we just created and place it somewhere on the map. If you want doodads to snap to the grid, select Grid Assist Mode for doodads before placing. Now that we have a background for the battle system, let's now set the enemy formation for the battle. Resize the list, name the formation, and select your enemy here, then click on the plus icon to add as many you need. After that, confirm, go back to the entity mode, select the entity that has the battle start script, and if it's not automatically selected already, select your enemy formation and the battle backdrop in the drop down here. Now let's playtest. The characters should appear together with the background. The positions are off slightly, since we still need to set the ideal position of the characters inside the database. Back to the Backgrounds tab, and before we start repositioning the characters, be sure the preview is updated. If it isn't, you might consider restarting the project, so a new resolution change will take effect in the preview. This is how the preview looked before I restarted the project. And this is how it looks now, updated. The reason for that is every time you change your resolution inside the video configuration, you will need to restart your project in order for the previews inside the database to take effect. However, this might change in future releases. Scale the preview a bit by setting the camera distance here to 4. With the XYZ values here, we can set the position of the enemy and heroes on the map by either writing down the values or by scrolling with the mouse wheel once we hover over the inputs. X will move them vertically, Z will move horizontally, and Y will move them up or down in 3D space. To illustrate that better, you have to think of them as 3 axes, where Y points up or down, and X and Z will be the axes on the floor. Let's add the hero now, and once all characters are positioned, confirm and playtest. Now everything should look a little better, except there are still enemies at the starting position here. And that's because I've set 4 enemies to appear inside the enemy formations, so I need to add 3 more and reposition them too. Back to the database, add 3 more enemies and reposition all of them and playtest again. What I did next was changing the hero's position, and in order to elevate all characters up, I changed also the Y position to 1. Then I set the focal point to be exactly on the floor by changing its Y position to 0. I then added more heroes to make up a full party. I did this the same way like for the first hero we created initially. But for these heroes I'm not using walking or idle sprites, so I don't need to assign them, because they'll be seen only on battle, so that's why I will go just with the battle sprites. I also didn't assign any colliders. Important is that you choose the correct frames from the sheet when assigning a battle sprite. In this case I choose the idle animation for the battle. As a side note, while I was recording the course, a new update came in to change the position of the traits to be on top and get its own tab. Same for the equipment slots, item types and skill types section, which we moved slightly to the left. Then under the background section I added 3 more hero positions and adjusted them accordingly. And since we created more heroes, we need to assign them to the party inside the new game tab. The same way like we did with the first hero before. Now that we have our heroes and enemies set up correctly for the battle, we can start working on the battle command menu next. Back to the database, go to user interfaces and resize to 2. First we will create the battle command menu. So rename it that way. Set the user interface type to menu, deactivate cancelable, add an element by clicking on the plus icon, select pane and rename it to commands BG. For background. So select your background image here, scroll down here and change the relative position of the X and Y values and the relative width and height to scale your elements. Next, copy-paste the command elements and rename it to subcommands BG. Then change the width to make it wider. Drag the subcommands BG on top so it displays behind of the command's background. If it doesn't change in the preview immediately, you might toggle the eye to update it. Next, let's add a for to the engine, which we can use for all the elements and lists. Go to the for families tab, resize, rename, and select a for here. I will just stick with one of the standard fors that come with Windows, and then go back to the menu. Add a text element and change the name to menu label. Change its color by using the same hex color code or use your own color for the label. The for family is automatically selected. Increase the font size, write in menu for the text, and adjust the positioning of the element. Under the battles configuration, select the menu and let's playtest now. The menu appears exactly at the position we set it before. Next are the commands. Back to user interfaces, add a templated list element, rename it to battle commands, set the template type to battle command, change the cursor's color mask to gray, or just use the same hex code here. Change the mask strategy for the cursor to component, select the sprite for the cursor and change the width to 50 and the height to 30 pixels. Then set the type to be mask, since that's the style we are after. Change the relative width and height for the item. Select grayscale if you want your items to be grayed out when disabled. Then change the relative X and Y positioning and relative height and width scaling for your templated list. Then select item components. Add a text element and rename it to name. Change the font size to 36, set the horizontal alignment to middle, check the box for use template, write in name or just select the name template from the dropdown. Then copy and paste the battle commands templated list and rename it to battle subcommands. Select use custom context and write in children or just select it from the dropdown. And because we copy pasted the templated list, we just need to adjust the relative width. We don't want it to overlap, so let's hide it when it is not focused. Add another templated list and call it targets. Set the template type to be battle command and use targets as custom context this time. That's it for now for the battle command menu. In the next section we are going to create the scripting for it. Next we will create the switches and variables for our battle commands. Under the data section go to switches and resize to 4. We will need target all, target random, is container, and is enabled for now, then confirm. Then for the variables resize to 2, rename them to battle command and target. Now select the battle commands templated list and under the script section select execute. Everything what is in here will pass through once you confirm the selection in battle with enter or space or whatever confirm is set to for your game under the virtual keys. With right click you can add commands, so let's add a save context unique ID command first and select the local variable we named battle command. This command will save the unique ID of the context to a variable. We need to do this because we will need to use that value as ID source. Then add a save value command, change it to switch and use battle command as source. Now we need to set the battle command variable as ID source for it. And select targets all enemies as use scope for the value we want to save. And then save that value inside a local switch, in that case inside target all. Add another save value command and repeat the process for target's random enemy and save that to target random. Add one more save value command, but this time we want to store the value of isContainer to another switch, like we did with the others. This one will contain the value, if for a skill grouping is enabled or not. We will get to skills later on. For now let's just set up the scripting of the menu. Next let's add a if-else condition command. Set it to local switch, isContainer is on. So if that's true, add a setUserInterfaceElement context command that sets the new context to be the templated list battle subcommands, and use current selection context. We also want to push the focus to it, so add a push focus command and select battle subcommands as templated list again. Also select the switch for select all to target all and for select random to target random. This way we ensure that the focus is pushed properly. As for the else branch, we want to set the same commands, but we will use targets as templated list. So the first branch will happen when skill grouping is enabled on that particular skill. If not, it will immediately push to targets. Next go to focused. Every time the templated list is focused, it will run the commands that are in here. Add a toggle user interface element visibility command and select the commands BG pane, which is our background for the main commands, and turn the visibility on. Let's copy paste this command 2 times and select the menu label text and the battle commands templated list. So every time battle commands is focused, it will turn the UI elements visibility on. Then go to item focused, add a set user interface element context command, set the target to battle subcommands and select use current selection context. We won't need item unfocused, so go to unfocused instead, and add a toggle user interface element visibility command and select commands BG, but this time leave the visibility off. Copy paste it 2 times and select menu label and battle commands. Now select the battle subcommands templated list and go to execute. Add a save context unique ID command and select the battle command local variable. Add a save value command and save the value for target all enemies to target all local switch. Add another one and repeat the same process, but for targets random enemy, and save that into the local switch target random. Add one more for isEnabled and save that to the isEnabled local switch. This will store the value for a command if it can be used or not, or if it's enabled or not. Then add a if-else condition and set the local switch isEnabled to be on as condition. Then if that's the case, set user interface element context to the targets templated list. Set it also to use current selection context. And push focus to the same templated list, and under select all set it to use target all, and under select random set it to target random. The execute section is, if you noticed, built the same way as for battle commands, except we will push focus immediately to targets if the skill is enabled. Next go to Focused, add a toggle user interface element visibility command, select subcommands BG and turn the visibility on. Add it one more time and select battle subcommands. Then go to Unfocused and add the same commands again, but set the visibility to off. Now select the templated list targets and go to Execute. Add schedule battle command and set the unique ID for battle command to be our local battle command variable. Set select all to use our local switch target all. Then set the unique ID for target to be our local target variable. Then set select random to use our local switch target random. With this command you can use your skills. It tells the engine which command and target IDs are used for that and which target selection is used. As for item focused, add a save context unique ID command and set the local variable to target. Then add show battle command targets this time and set the battle command unique ID to be our local variable battle command. Select all to be our local target all switch. For target unique ID to be our local target variable. And select random to be our local target random switch. This command is responsible to show the selection of the targets. Lastly, go to Unfocused and add clear battle command targets. This way, when the templated list is losing focus, the commands will be cleared out. Since we have the logic now for the battle command menu established, we will be creating skills next. We will need to establish the skill types first. Resize to 2, name it to attack, and select an icon. Repeat the process for the second one, but name it skill and select skill grouping. The difference is that for attack, when we select a skill with that skill type, it will use the attack skill immediately. But for skill, since skill grouping is enabled, it will push to the sub-menu where our skills are listed. Next go to the Skills tab, resize to 2 and rename the first skill to Attack. Assign the Attack skill type and give it a description. Select an icon. Uncheck is used in menu, since we want to use it only in battle and set the success formula to 100. That means this skill will always hit. And this use scope, set it to enemy, since we want to be able to attack enemies only. Copy paste that skill and rename the second one to Fire Explosion and set the skill type to be skill. That's the one with skill grouping enabled. Change the description and select an icon. Next, go to the Characters tab, select the skill types this character can use and add trait elements inside the Traits tab, which is in your version at the top and not at the bottom here, like I mentioned before. And select the rank, the trait and the skill from the dropdown. That's how to set up skills for your character. However, you will need to create statistics next in order to calculate damage and cost for the skills, but also set up all the statistics like for level, experience, strength and so on. Go to the statistics section, resize to 8, name the first one to level, use the rank category. For formula name, we will go with LV. Set the minimum value to 1 and maximum to 10. We will import an Excel table later on, and the statistics we create are based on that, so it's important to keep all the values the same. Next one, name it to experience. Set it to grow, the formula name to XP, the minimum value to 1 and maximum to 9999. Next are the hit points. Set the category to store, formula name to HP, and maximum to 9999. We can leave the rest as it is. Next are the action points. Set it also to store, formula name is AP, and maximum to 9999. Then next is strength. This time we can leave it at core. Formula name is SDR. Minimum value is 1 and maximum is 999. Next is vitality. Category is core. Formula name is VTL. Minimum is 1 and maximum is 999. Next we need agility. Category also core. Formula name is AGI. Minimum is 1 and maximum 999. And wisdom. Category is core. Formula name is WIS. Minimum is 1 and maximum 999. Back to the characters tab. Under statistics we can now select the rank, which is level, the grow, which is experience, and increase the ranks to a maximum of 10, since that is what we have set before. Now we can double click in here and change all the values as we need them. However, we can also use an Excel table and import it to our statistics. You can find the table inside the statistics folder, which is provided inside the reference projects folder. I have created these inside an Excel table and exported them as CSV file, but I recommend to use the statistics file that is provided. Now we can also set the rank for the traits. Again, the traits tab is at the top for your version of the engine, since the update for the new positioning of them was while I was recording the videos. Now we should be able to select the attack skill, which makes the battle commands templated list disappear, because we changed its visibility to off once the templated list is unfocused. Get back to it with escape. Then when we select a skill, we should be pushed to the sub-commands templated list, which contains our fire explosion skill. This works only because skill grouping is enabled, and inside the sub-commands templated list we have set a condition for it, to push only when this container is true, which checks if the skill has skill grouping enabled, so that it can push the focus from battle commands to battle sub-commands. If that's not true, then the focus will be pushed to the target's templated list, which are in this case the enemies. Next, let's visualize the selection of our targets. We can do this by setting up an animation for our cursor. But we will need animations to also set up visual effects for our skills. So let's do that next. Back to the database, go to the animations tab and resize to 1 for now. Name the animation to character selector. Leave the interval at 100 milliseconds per frame. Select loop animation, since we want the animation to play all the time. If that's unchecked, then the animation will loop just once. Select any test character to visualize the animation on. And be sure the width and height multiplier is set accordingly, same as the zoom level, for the elements we are going to work with on the timeline. With left click you can select a frame, then with right click go to add. To select an element, select graphic, since we want to add an image for each frame. Select the element and click on the image selector and choose character selector. Set the frame width and height to 64. Here we can change the scaling of the frame for the X and Y axis, set both to 0.5. Then under translation we can set the position of the frame along the positive or negative X and Y axis. Set Y to be at 90, this will move it slightly up. The Z value will move the frame in front of the sprites with positive values or behind other sprites with negative values. So set it to 1 since we want it to appear in front of the character sprites. Then copy paste the same element to the next frame and select the second frame from the sheet. Repeat this process until all 10 frames are selected, which makes up the full animation. To zoom in the timeline, hover with your mouse over it and hold Ctrl and move the mouse wheel forward. To drag the timeline, hold middle mouse button and drag to the left or right. To zoom out again, hold Ctrl and move the mouse wheel backward. To see a preview of the animation, press the play button here. To change the frame speed, you can put in here a different value which will change the time the animation will loop in milliseconds per frame. Now back to the Battles configuration settings and select our targeting animation we created. Now we can see our cursor animation when targeting characters. This way we have a good idea now what the current target in our battle system is. Let's add the same statistics to our enemy. We can repeat this process and assign to the rest of the party also the same statistics. Now that all characters have statistics assigned, we can now make the skills use action points as cost for the usage and make them inflict damage to the target, based on the statistics. But we need to first set up the movement and actions of the characters when using skills. For that we need to create battle poses first. Back to the database, go to battle poses and resize to 6. Select the character as template for the sprite sheet. And rename the first battle pose to Hero Idle. Select Cycle Animation to make this pose loop. Set the frame duration to 200 milliseconds per frame to make it a bit slower. Set the frame count to be 8 frames for this sprite sheet and select the idle animation, which is the third from the top along the y-axis. Now copy paste the same pose and rename it to Hero Approach. Set the frame duration to 80 to make it a little faster. And select the correct animation for approach. At this point we should delete the cycle animation, but let's leave it in there, so we can see what the difference is later on. Repeat the process and call it Hero Load, and set the duration to 100, and select the corresponding sprite animation. Next up is Hero Attack, set the duration to 50 and select the corresponding animation. Next is Hero Return, set the duration to 80 and then select the return animation. Then the next is Hero Being Hit. Duration is 50 and select the corresponding animation. We have assigned 6 poses for the hero. Now just repeat the process for the enemy character. For that select the enemy character as template and copy paste all the poses and change the names and animations accordingly. Here are the poses named that I used for the Goblin Mage. Next go to action sequences. Resize to 2, name the first one Hero Basic Attack. Click on the Activation tab. Everything in here will be the starting animation for the action sequence. With right click add in a battle pose element and set it to Hero Idle. From top to bottom we have the name of the element, the start time of it, where it's positioned on the timeline, wait to complete, which lets you decide to have the element complete its pose animation before the next elements continue along the timeline. Battle pose lets you choose the pose that you made. Apply to target lets you select the target instead of the user to change the pose. Apply to user is what we need, so this pose will be applied to the character who is using it. And reset pose will reset the character's animation to the default one. Then go to acting. Everything in here will be the main action of the character. Add the approach pose to the timeline. Then below it add a relative movement element. Set the duration to 640 milliseconds. That's the amount of the time until the movement is finished, and also the amount until the pose animation is finished. If we go back to the pose for approach, we can see that it's set to 80 milliseconds per frame, and since it is a 8 frame animation, 8 times 80 is 640, so we need to set the duration for the movement to 640 milliseconds in order to go through the whole loop once. Then activate wait to complete. This way the next elements on the timeline after the relative movement element won't play until it's done. Then set it to move by 80%, that means the character will move 80% of the full range towards the target while using his approach pose. Click on the very next frame here and add the attack pose to the timeline. Right below it add a wait element and set it to 400 for the duration and wait to complete. So after the character finished his movement towards the target, he will perform his attack. Click on the next frame and add the enemy being hit pose. And change it to apply to target. Be aware you select enemy being hit here and not hero being hit. Then add a wait element that is 300 milliseconds long and set wait to complete. So after the character performed his attack, the enemy will use his being hit pose as a reaction to the hero's attack. Next add a enemy idle pose, set it to apply to target. And add a wait element, set it to 50 and wait to complete. After the enemy was hit, we need to reset his pose to normal again. Then add a hero return pose. Followed by relative movement, set it to 640 for the duration. Select wait to complete and this time set it to return to start. The character will then move to his default position while using his return animation. Next let's add a battle pose element. Write in 2050 in order to make it fit exactly on the very next frame. Select reset pose and be sure apply to user is also selected. So this will after the character return to his initial position reset his pose to default again. The action sequence will end here. Next copy paste the action sequence to the second position in the list and rename it to enemy basic attack. As for activation, change the pose to enemy idle here. As for acting, change the first pose to enemy approach. The second pose to enemy attack. The third pose change to hero being hit. The fourth to hero idle. The fifth pose to enemy return. And the last one is unchanged. This action sequence can be used now for the enemy. Now to add the action sequences to the battle system, go to configuration and set them for the enemy and the hero. If we playtest, the hero should now be able to perform his action when using an attack. Let's assign the same skill to the other characters. As for the enemy, go to the Enemies tab, under Battle Programming and add a battle condition. Set it to always. Right click inside the action section and choose skill, then select the skill from the drop-down and set the rank to 1. When we playtest, we can attack with the first hero, but we cannot make the next hero perform his action. Because we are using a counter-based battle system, we need to set up the formula for the counters. Back to the database, inside the battles configuration, we have counter-based set as battle system. To set the counter formula, scroll down and for the increment formula write in 50. The maximum can be at 100, and for the counter target formula set it also to 100. Increment formula calculates how fast characters accumulate the counter. Maximum formula is how high the counter can reach, so if you set it to 200 it will go that far. And target formula is how soon the character can perform an action based on the counter. Let's playtest. We can now attack with every character. Right now the counter increment has a fixed value of 50. Later on, when we learn about formulas, we can for example use the character statistic value as reference for the speed of the increment formula for the counter. Also, you might have noticed that all the characters' battle poses are looping because we copy-pasted the poses before together with the cycle animation from the idle. And as I said before, I left it in there so we can see what the differences are. To fix that, go back to the database and deactivate cycle animation for all poses, except for the idle poses. We do need cycle animations for certain poses sometimes, but in this case we don't need it for one-time actions like attack or return. We need it more for the idle pose, or everything that is meant to loop all the time. Now when we playtest, all the characters' poses will loop once, except for the idle, which should loop always. Let's go back to the backgrounds and slightly change the positioning of the enemies, so they line up with the side of the heroes better. Since when they move towards each other, they should be lined up properly. Another reason is that we need the space at the bottom, since later on we are going to create a battle overlay, and we don't want it to overlap the characters. When we perform an attack with the fire explosion skill, it will use the same action sequence. Since we didn't set up a custom sequence for fire explosion, the action sequence that is set inside the configuration settings will be used instead. Let's create a custom one for fire explosion. For that I just created 2 more animations for fire explosion. The same way like with the character selector animation. You could just copy and paste that animation and select the load fire explosion animation from the image selector and set the scale for X and Y to 3. Then set the Y position to -50 to move it down a bit, and the Z position to -1 to move the animation behind the character. Then I copy pasted the graphic elements for each frame and selected the corresponding frames for each graphic element. For example, if you're on the first frame on the timeline, you need to select the first frame of the sprite animation, until you have the full animation of Tang along the timeline. I did this the same way for the second animation, but select the fire explosion animation from the image selector instead, and set the Z value to be 1, since we want this animation to appear in front of the characters. Now let's go back to the action sequences. Resize the list to 3, rename it to Eric Fire Explosion. Then go to activation and add a idle pose. Then inside acting, add a hero approach pose. Add relative movement at the same frame on the timeline. Set the duration to 640. Set weight to complete. Select from center of targets and change the distance to 40%. This time we just want the character to move away from the group slightly to perform his action. Add a hero load pose next. Then add an animation element below it and select only targets user. Then select the load fire explosion animation from the dropdown. This animation will appear when the hero moved out from the group and is performing his load pose. Then add a wait element, set it to 800, since the animation takes some time until it's finished. But you can increase the duration if you want. For now let's just stick with 800 and set it to wait to complete. Then add a hero attack pose on the next frame. And add a wait with a duration of 400 and set wait to complete. Next add a enemy being hit pose and select apply to target. Add a animation element like before, but select the fire explosion animation. Add a wait element and set the duration to 300 and select wait to complete. Add a enemy idle pose next and select apply to target. Add a wait and set the duration to 50 and select wait to complete. Next, add a hero return pose. Add a relative movement element on the same position of the timeline. Set the duration to 640. Select wait to complete. And return to start. Add another pose. Change the start time to be on 2850 milliseconds, so it's exactly positioned on the next frame. And change it to reset pose. Go back to the animations and deactivate looping, since you want to make it cycle once through the animation, and set target feed, so it's at a lowered position on the character. Next, go to the fire explosion skill and set the custom action sequence we just created. Now the fire explosion skill has its own action sequence. However, the position of the explosion is still a little too high. So let's decrease the Y position a bit for every frame on the timeline. And when we playtest, the explosion should be more centered now. Now we can add 4 more skills for the rest of the party and for the enemy the same way like with the fire explosion. Set the animations for them. And assign the skills inside the traits tab, which is again at the top of your version of the engine, to every character of your party. And for the enemy, change the attack skill to Dark Void instead, for now. As for the action sequences, you can copy-paste the fire explosion, but rename it to the new skill. And then change the animations along the timeline, to the corresponding one. And for the basic attack action sequence, add a basic attack animation when the enemy is being hit. Use the provided project as reference, but focus only at the elements we have learned about in this video, since the project contains the final version of the battle system. So here's the approach you should follow in this order. First, open the reference project so you can compare, and inside your project create the animations for load air punch, load bone crusher, load death blow, load dark void, and basic attack. These are the animations you focus on. Ignore the rest inside your reference project for now. Second, go to the action sequences and create them for Drill Bit Air Punch, Halvor Bone Crusher, Godfrey Death Blow, and Goblin Mage Dark Void. Third, go to the skills tab and create the skills for Air Punch, Bone Crusher, Death Blow, and Dark Void. Ignore the right side of the skills where the damage and cost are set for now. We will get to them later on. Fourth, go to the character traits and assign the skills to them. Give to the rest of the party the attack skill, and for Drill Bit Air Punch, for Halvor Bone Crusher, and for Godfrey Death Blow. Ignore the other skills for now. Fifth, go to the enemies tab and only change the enemy skill to Dark Void. If you followed all these steps, then you can move on. When playtesting, every character has its own skill now that you can use. Next, let's add sound effects to the battle system. Let's begin with the action sequences. Add a combat attack sound to the basic attack action sequence by adding a sound effect element to the timeline. Then select one from your content folder. Repeat this process for the rest of the action sequences. Use the same sound effects provided in your reference project. Next, go to the audio configuration settings and set the sound effects for your menu here. You should then hear sound effects for the menu, the selector and the skills. And also for the basic attack skill. Every time we start the battle, the subcommands menu is visible. But we only want it to appear once we select one of the subcommands. So let's change that. Go back to the user interface, select loaded under the script section, and toggle the user interface for subcommands BG to off. And do the same for the battle subcommands templated list. This way, when the menu opens up, it will load the scripts inside here first. Now when we start the battle again, the subcommands will only appear when selected. Now let's add portraits that appear next to the battle commands for each character when we are going to choose a skill. And after that, let's create a battle overlay. Go back to the user interface and add a templated list element. Name it to portraits. And select a template type. For the item components, change the relative width to 100 and the relative height to 56. Then for the templated list, the relative X position to 33.5, relative Y position to 24. Relative width to 9 and relative height to 28. Then select the item components. Add a pane and name it to portrait. Let's use commands BG3 as background and change the relative X position to -7, relative Y position to -7, relative width to 113 and relative height to 111. Add another pane and call it nameBG. Select the same PNG file as background. Then change its position on X to -7, on Y to 104, the relative width to 113 and relative height to 38. Add a picture element, rename it to nameBG. Select use template and write in user portrait model. Then only change the relative Y position to 1. Add a text element, rename it to name. Change the font size to 34, use template again and write in username. Change the relative X position to 3 and relative Y position to 113. Let's playtest. Every character has his portrait now appear next to the battle commands as soon as it's his turn. Now we need to create a battle overlay for the characters at the bottom, in order to keep track of their hit points, action points and counter. Let's create another user interface and name it to battle overlay. Be sure overlay is selected for the type. And now select battlers as the context. Add a templated list, rename it to statistics. Set the orientation to be horizontal and set a template type. Change the item's relative width to 25 and relative height to 100. Change the templated list's relative X position to 4 and relative Y position to 77. Then select the item components. Add a pane and name it to portrait BG. Then select commands BG3 as background. Change its relative width to 37 and relative height to 15. Copy paste the pane element and rename it to portrait 2 BG. Change the relative X position to 37 and the relative width to 27. Copy paste the last pane again and rename it to HB BG. but change the background to Commands BG4. Change the relative X position to 13, the relative Y position to -2.3, relative width to 35 and relative height to 3. Repeat the process like before, but rename the next element to APBG. And only change the relative X position to 0, relative Y position to 15 and relative height to 2.5. Add another element and rename it to CounterBG. Change its relative Y position to 17 and relative height to 4.6. Add another pane this way and rename it to rpgarchitect. Change the background to GageBG. Change the relative X position to 14, relative Y position to -1.7, relative width to 32 and relative height to 1.5. Add another pane and rename it to rpgarchitect. Change the relative X position to 1.5 and the relative Y position to 15.5. Rename the next pane to CounterGageBG. And change the relative Y position to 17.5 and the relative height to 3.5. This time add a picture element and rename it to Portrait. Select Use Template and write in Portrait Model. Change the relative X position to 1.7, the relative Y position to 1, the relative width to 33.5 and the relative height to 13.6. Next add a gauge element and rename it to rpGauge. As for the current value, write in statistics HP, but the HP is in brackets. The fill image use rpGauge and change the frame width to 124 and height to 24. For the maximum value, write in statistics max HP, but the max HP is in brackets. Change the relative X position to 14, the relative Y position to -1.7, the relative width to 32 and the relative height to 1.5. Copy-paste gauge and rename it to rpGauge. For the current value, change the statistics HP to AP. For the fill image, use rpGauge. For the maximum value, change the statistics max HP to max AP. Change the relative X position to 1.5 and the relative Y position to 15.5. Paste another gauge and rename it to CounterGauge. For the current value, write int counter as integer. For the fill image, select CounterGauge. For the maximum value, set it to 100. Then change the relative Y position to 17.5 and the relative height to 3.5. Now add a text element, rename it to label HP. Change the color to an orange or write down the same hex code as here. Change the font size to 50. As for the text, write in HP. Change the relative X position to 1 and relative Y position to -5. Copy-paste the text element and rename it to label AP. Change the text to AP and change the relative X position to 37 and relative Y position to 15. Then create a new text element and rename it to Start HP. Change the font size to 60, template and write in statistics HP, but HP is in brackets. Change the relative X position to 35 and the relative Y position to -7. Copy paste the text element and rename it to Start AP. Change the statistics HP to AP. Change the relative X position to 40 and relative Y position to 9. Go to the battle configurations and select the battle overlay for the battle system. Now when we start the battle, we should have an overlay that displays portraits, health points, action points and counter for our characters. In case you don't have a full party of 4, and you can see the enemies on your battle overlay, you can change that if you go back to the user interface. Under the context, we set it to use the battlers as context. That means all of the battlers are listed in the overlay. To list only the hero characters, you need to use a filter by adding it here and write in is hero equals true. Then all heroes will be listed except for the enemies. If you want only the enemies to be listed, you can write in is enemy instead, and then only the enemies will be seen. But we will go through that later when we define states for the characters. Alright, next we can see that only the counter gauge is changing, but HP and AP don't change in value. That's because we need to set the cost for the skills that are being used and the damage they do. So let's do this next. Back to the database, select the attack skill, and at the top right under user effects is where we set up the cost for the skill. Let's add an element and select formula from the dropdown. Then in here we can select any of the statistics we have set before. Let's select action points. And write in -10 as value. This will reduce the action points by 10 when the attack skill is used. Next under target effects, add an element and select again formula, then hit points. Write in -user.str inside parentheses. Or just select it from the dropdown where you can find all the available options for your characters. This way the hit points of the target will be reduced by the amount of the strength of the character. RPGArchitect lets you define a wide collection of different mathematical operations and formulas, which we will cover later on. Now let's change the user effects and target effects for all the remaining skills this way. Now all the characters' hit points and action points values will change once they use any skill on each other. However, we want to have a visual representation of the numbers when the skill is being used on a target. So let's add that next. Back to the action sequences, select the hero basic attack sequence and at the same position of the enemy being hit pose, add a result element and set it to target result. Add a result element for each action sequence at the same position on the timeline. Then go to the battles configuration settings and under the action results section we can define how the numbers should be generated. Set the font size to 50, select effects and add a movement element. Set the duration to 1000 milliseconds, that's the duration the result numbers are displayed. And set the velocity to 1. This will make the numbers elevate up once they appear. Now every time when someone is being hit, we can see the amount of damage taken. Right now the damage is the same for all characters, since every hero is at the same level, same for the enemy. In order to make all characters inflict a different damage, which is based on their statistics, we need to go to New Game, and under Party Members, we can change the level for each hero here. As for the enemies, go to Enemy Formations and here you can set the level for each enemy individually. If it doesn't reflect the change you made immediately, you might reopen the database. All battlers should now have different stats and apply different damage to each other, based on their rank. Let's now learn how to create an item with an healing effect animation and use that item in battle. Go to the item types and resize to 1. Rename it to consumable. Set maximum stacked items to 99. Then go to items and resize to 1. Rename it to apple. Select the consumable item type, write in the description. Select an icon. Select is used in battle. And set the use scope to be ally, since we only want to heal our heroes. Next, add an element, select statistic, and then hit points. And let's make the apple heal by 25% of the total hit points. As for the heal animation, you can create them like with the others but use the heal animation as graphic. As for the action sequence, add a hero load pose at the beginning, then add a wait element with a duration of 800 milliseconds and select wait to complete. On the next frame, add a result element for target, then the animation for the heal effect, then a sound effect and another wait with a duration of 400 and select wait to complete. Then on the last frame reset the pose. Once you have your action sequence set up, use it as custom action sequence inside the apple's battle settings. Next, in order to use that item, we need to create a skill type for it, call it item, and hide when unusable. Then create an item skill, set the name and the skill type. Select is used in battle and is item use. Select consumable as item type and item as skill type. Assign the skill to each character in the party under the traits tab. Now we need to assign the item to the inventory of the party. Go to new game and select inventory. And add the apple a couple of times to the inventory. If you have more items created, you can select them from the drop-down. Now we can use items and see the result of the amount that was healed. If you want to have a skill make damage to multiple targets at once, you change the use scope to all enemies. You can also create healing effects for the whole party this way, but change the use scope accordingly. Right now attacks we use will always hit, but if you want to change the success rate, you can do this under the skill success formula and let's set it to 5 for now. So the lower the value you put in here, the less likely it is to hit a target with the attack skill, and the value of 100 will make the skill always successful. Write in a failure message as indicator if you miss. Now this way you have control over the success of each skill for your characters. Later on, when we learn about formulas, you will be able to set up a custom way to calculate the success rate. Next, let's work on effects that occur inside or outside of the battle. Go to status effects and resize to 2. Rename the first one to enemy defeat. Then select remove after battle, which will remove the status effect after the battle is over. And remove enemy from battle, which is the case when the enemy is defeated, but we have to set a condition for that here. Add an element, select hit points, choose the less than or equal to operator from the dropdown, set it to isValue and leave it at 0. When the enemy has 0 hit points or less, then the condition is met, and he will be removed from battle. The second status effect is for the hero characters, so rename it to hero defeat, but choose clear battle actions, disable battle action, disable battle counter grow, and remove character from battle, and create the same condition. Then select enemy defeat under mutually exclusive status effects, and hero defeat for the other status effect, so that they cannot occur at the same time. Then we need a removal action sequence for the hero. For that, just create one without activation, and for acting add a hero being hit pose, a sound effect, and a color flash element this time. Set it to wait to complete, and duration can be 500. Then set a color for the end and one for the start. So this color flash will fade the character from red to grey over 500 milliseconds. Then we need a removal action sequence for the enemy, which is the same except for the pose. It's set to enemy being hit. Then go to Battles configuration and choose the removal action sequences for enemy and hero from the dropdown. Then select defeat condition and add an element. Choose party status effect from the dropdown. And select the status effect, hero defeat, we just created. As for the victory condition, select enemy formation status effect and choose enemy defeat. Then go to defeat script. Here we can define what should happen after the defeat condition is true. Add a game over command, so when the party is defeated, it will transition out. As for the victory condition, let's add a end battle command. And select return to prior scene. After the enemy is defeated, it will transition back to the map. To test this, increase the damage for some skills to make them one-hit the enemy. Same for the enemy skill. Then select the battle overlay and use a filter to have only the hero characters show up on the overlay, since we are using the battler's context for it. It will display all of the battlers on the battlefield, and we have to use filter to restrict them to heroes or enemies. For hero, set it to is hero equals true, or is enemy if you want the enemy to be shown. Now every time someone is defeated, the action sequence for the removal should play. In this case, when the whole party is defeated, our defeat script is true and it will transition out. However, if the enemy is defeated, then our victory script is true and we will be transitioned out to the prior scene on the map. However, the battle seems to restart again, and that's because we will return at the same position when we were colliding with the enemy before. So we need to add a script to remove the enemy from the map, or it will repeat the battle over and over again. For that, select the Goblin Mage entity and add a condition to him. Set a global switch with the name enemy defeated to off. So when this switch is off, we can start the battle. Then go to the database, select the victory script, and add a wait for 5 seconds on top. So it will wait for a while before exiting the battle, and then change the switch we just created to on. Now when the enemy is defeated, it will wait for 5 seconds. The goblin mage entity is gone, and we can move freely on the map without restarting the battle after we won. Next, let's create a regeneration status effect. For that, just create another animation and use the regeneration image for the graphic, like we did it with the other animations. Create 10 graphic elements and assign a frame to each and set the X and Y scale for them and the Z translation. And be sure you check these options here. This time add target elements to the timeline and change its color gradually from the first frame to the fourth. Use the reference project as guidance for that. Then create another animation called Load Berserk. Use the Load Berserk image as graphic for it. Then create a Berserk animation the same way like for regeneration, and use target elements for the color flash. Then go to status effects and add one more to the list for now. We will create one at a time. Call it regeneration buff. Select end when any ongoing effect ends, then select use animation on battler and choose the regeneration animation we just created. And select remove after battle. Add an element to ongoing effects. Change it to turn or action after. Put in 1 for occurs every and 5 to occurs for. And for the formula select hit points and write in 50. So this will occur after every turn or action for 5 turns or actions. And it will heal 50 hit points to the target. Then add another element under enter effects. Be sure statistic is set. Select hit points, adjust by value and write in 250. This effect will occur at the beginning of the status effect once. Add another status effect to the list, copy paste the previous one and rename it to Berserk buff. Delete the ongoing effect and change the enter effect to use strength, but keep the value of 250. However, status effects also exist outside of battle, so reduce strength by the same amount under exit effects. This will make sure when the battle is over, the strength of the target will reset again. If you can't see the animation for your status effects you have selected, you might select also use animation on character. However, if your animations show up correctly, then you don't need to do this step. Then create 2 action sequences. For the regeneration sequence, add a hero attack pose at the beginning and a wait at the same position, with a duration of 400 milliseconds and set wait to complete. On the next frame we have an animation for the load section. For that we can use the heal animation, since that fits to the skill. Then add a sound effect and a wait with a duration of 500 and set wait to complete. Then reset the pose. For the Berserk sequence, it's built the same way, but use the load Berserk animation instead, and a different sound effect. Then create skills for them like we did before, and set the use scope for the regeneration skill to user and allies, and for the Berserk skill to user only. Now we need to add the state effect to the skill. Add an element and select state this time, and choose the regeneration buff. For the regeneration skill, set it to add and set the success formula to 100. And for the Berserk skill, add the Berserk buff state. Then add the regeneration skill to Eric and Drillbit under the traits tab, which is again for your version at the top. And add the Berserk skill to Halvor and Gottfried. Let's change the damage for all skills to user.strength as formula. Now when we start the battle again, all our characters have the ability to use buffs. If you want to create buffs that inflict damage to the enemy, you only change the use scope of the targets and use negative values for the effects. Now that we know how to create action sequences and battle poses, simply create another one for Victory and assign it here under the battle's configuration settings. As for the action sequence, I just added a hero attack pose with a wait element and duplicated it 3 more times along the timeline. Now that we also know how to create and use status effects, let's create 2 more. The first one is called Offensive Buff, which will increase the strength of the target. The second is called Life Buff, which will increase the maximum hit points of the target, and it also has an ongoing effect once it's used. Now that we know how to create animations too, create a Load Offensive, Offensive, Load Life, and Life animation, and assign the load animations to the action sequences, which are the same as the previous ones, but with different animations and sound effects. And the looping animations, Offensive and Life in this case, to the status effects. And use the reference project as guidance. Then set up the skills for each of them. And this time add the skills to every hero. Now that we know how to create a user interface for the battle, let's create a game over screen next. For that, add another user interface to the list. Rename it to game over, set it to be a menu, uncheck is scarce level. Use a paint for the background, scale it and reposition it. And use a text element for the game over text that will be shown, and adjust the font size and reposition it. Then go to the game over tab, set the background music, and select your menu over here, if it isn't already selected. Then set the victory music next. Go to the battle's configuration settings, and in here you can set the music for victory. Now if you win the battle, the victory music should play a couple of times. Next, let's create a way to escape the battle. First, create a skill type called Escape. Then create a skill with the same name and set it up like a normal skill with a custom action sequence. But this time select Auto Target. Be sure it's set to is used in battle and set it to is Escape. As for the action sequence, I've added a hero return pose and a wait element. Then select the Escape skill type and add the skill to each character. Again, the skills are at the top under traits for your RPGA version. Then we need to work on the script to make it work properly. Go to User Interfaces, select the Battle Commands templated list, then select Execute. Add the Save Value command, set it to Switch. Use battle command as source. For the unique ID source, use our battle command local variable. Then select Auto Target as property. And save it to a new local switch, which we need to create first. Call it Auto Target. Then under the else section of the condition, add another condition that checks if the local switch Auto Target is on. If that's the case, then it should schedule the battle commands. So add schedule battle command, set the battle command unique ID to our local variable battle command, set the target unique ID to our local variable target, Set select all to all local switch target all. Set select random to all local switch target random. Then copy paste the elements from the else branch inside the else branch of the auto target condition and delete the other ones. Now go to the battle's configuration settings. We will need to set our escape script. For that, copy paste the wait element from the victory script over, but reduce the duration to 1 second. And copy paste the switch over for the goblin mage condition we have set up before. And the end battle script. Now when we escape, we should leave the battle. In case you want to play a sound effect when escaping, you can add a sound effect to the escape script. And here you can change the escape chance for each formation individually. Next, let's learn how to create custom formulas for calculations. Go to the skills section and select the basic attack skill. Here we can now define a custom formula, or at any place where it says formula at the end. Let's start with something simple first, to calculate our success rate. Let's write in parentheses user.lv times user.agi divided by 8. This formula will first multiply the character level with the agility and divide it by 8. So with something that simple, we can already make the success rate of an attack based on the character's level and attributes. You can put in here all attributes you have defined or use other mathematical operations. Let's change the formula for the cost of the skill next. Write in, for example, minus in parentheses 10 plus sqrt in parentheses user.str. This way, the base cost of 10 will always be the same, and the stronger the hero gets, the higher the cost for the skill, based on the square root function of the user strength attribute. The attributes and abbreviations are based on the statistics we have created before. Now let's work on the damage formula for the skill. Write in minus in parentheses user.str plus dice in parentheses 2,12 plus in parentheses sqrt in parentheses user.lv times 4. With this formula, the target will take damage equal to the strength of the character plus a random dice value. In this case, the dice function will roll 2 dice where each has 12 sides. Then it will add the square root of the character's level multiplied by 4 on top of that. So this way, the damage will increase the stronger the character is and the higher his level. And the dice function is just to add in a random value between 2 and 24 to that. That's just an example, but you can take this even further or make it completely different based on your game. For example, you could use the dice function alone and increase the amount of dice the stronger the character becomes, or increase the size of dice. You can make it work to whatever fits best for you. If you take a look at the wiki's formula section, you can find a great variety of functions you can use for your formulas. You could also use an absolute function, arccosine function, arctangent, cosine, dice pool, logarithm functions, and so much more. Go to enemies and change the skill to attack, so we can test it for all characters. Then go to the battles configuration. Since our battle system is set to counter based, scroll down to the counter based battle section to define the formula for the counter increment. We can same as before use a complex formula if you want, but for now let's just write in AGI. This will use the agility statistic of each character as base to increment their counter. This way the character with the highest agility will be the first who can perform an action. Now when we start the battle, Halvor's counter gauge will reach the maximum first, followed by Gottfried, then Eric, and then Drillbit. Since Halvor is at the highest level, he has the highest agility value. Notice how the action points cost and damage for the attack skill are different now. Sometimes it doesn't change the action points values. That's because they didn't hit the target. Also notice how the enemies are now attacking before the next hero can perform his action, since the agility values of the enemies are for some higher than for the heroes. The statistics table for all characters is the same. The only difference here is the rank of the characters we have set before. If you don't want a counter-based battle system, you can select turn-based instead. The counter-based formulas will be grayed out, and the turn-based formulas are accessible then. Let's make the order based on the agility again. And as for the reduction formula, you can use the same attribute. Now we won't have a counter increasing as visual reference, so you could delete that part if you don't use it for anything else, and make your battle system based on turns. Let's turn it back to counter-based, and the formulas we set up before will also remain the same as we left them. If you want to change the battle system to not start on an external map, but rather on the current map where you encounter enemies, you just change to occurs on current map instead. And for the backgrounds, you change the battlefield map to the encounter map. You might also adjust the positioning of your battles afterwards to fit on your map. And you will also need to change the focal point to the new map you selected as background. Let's get back to the configurations. If you want to use a battle system with an image as background, then select occurs on user interface instead. Then under backgrounds, you select background layers. Add an element, rename it, and select the background image you want to use. If you have an image that you want to use as foreground, then you can do the same but with foreground layers. If you want it to show up, you have to set the relative width and height of it, in case it isn't already. And when you reposition your characters, you will need to use higher values to reposition them on the background, since it will offset in pixels instead of tiles. Let's change the battle system back to occurs on external map and be sure the battlefield map is selected again. Next we need to learn how to define the behavior of our enemies. For that, go to the enemies tab, and in this section we can define how the enemies are fighting or what's happening in battle when certain conditions are met, so we are able to work on the AI of the enemies in this section. Here we can set the condition. It's set to always, and down here are the actions of the enemy. In this case, the goblin mage will always perform the attack skill when in battle. The next condition we can set is the enemy formation status effect. This condition is true when certain status effects are applied to the enemy formation. Next we can define a global switch as condition to be either on or off. Then we can set a global variable to compare with the value as condition. Next we can set the statistics and compare with a given value. Then we can set the status effect as condition for the enemy. Or we can set the status effect of the party as condition. Or we can set the condition to random with the percentage value. We can add multiple conditions by clicking here. Right now it's set to all conditions need to be met in order to perform the attack skill action. Or we can also change it to any condition, so just any of the conditions need to be met in order for the enemy to use the attack skill. Now let's delete all of them and set it to have one always condition like before. As for the actions, we can alter the statistics. For example, we can change the maximum hit points by a certain value. Or we could set up the enemy to do nothing, if we want to make him skip a turn if a certain condition is met, for example. Then we could change the value of a global switch. Or we could do the same with a global variable. We can also replace the enemy with another one, if we have more enemies. Or we can also change the battle pose of the enemy. Use skill is what we were using from the beginning. Here we can set the skills for the enemy that he should use in battle. We could use a wait action to make the battle delay by a certain amount while it's the enemy's turn. Let's delete everything with right click and delete. Then let's create a new battle condition, select my statistic and set it to hit points. Set the operator to be greater than and write in a value of 600. And for actions, select the attack skill and set it to rank 1. And select all conditions met. Then add another battle condition. Same as before, set a my statistic as condition. Select hit points, but this time use the less than or equals to operator. And set the value to 600. And for the action, add the Dark Void skill and set to rank 1. So this enemy will use the attack skill when the hit points are above 600 and use the Dark Void skill when the hit points are at 600 or less. Now when we playtest, one of the goblins we inflict damage to should start using his Dark Void skill once his hit points are at 600 or below. Here in this section we can set the battle rewards once the enemies are defeated. Same as with battle conditions, we can add them here and select them from the dropdown. These are the same conditions as for the battle conditions, so we will go through the reward section next. We can add equipment if we have created it and set the quantity and rank rate. We can also set a global switch to have a certain value as reward. We could also change the value of global variables. Items can be set as reward and the quantity. We can add money as reward to be either a certain amount or random between minimum and maximum value. And we can also change the statistic as reward. For example, if you defeat a strong character, you might get a strength boost by a certain or random amount. Let's delete it again. Since we understand now how to program the behavior of the enemy and set the rewards, let's add 2 more elements to the user interface before we wrap it up. We want to add a window for the skill that is being used at the top of the battle scene for the heroes. Go to the user interface. Add a pane element to the battle command menu, rename it to skill name BG. Set the background graphic to commands BG3 and change the relative X position to 36, the relative Y position to 2, the relative width to 27 and the relative height to 16. Next, add a text element and rename it to skill name. Change the font size to 50 and before you can use template, be sure is linked to UI context is selected. Then select Use Template and write in global 1, but 1 is in brackets. We will get to the global variable in a moment. Next, change the relative x position to 42 and relative y position to 7. Now, as for the global variable, be sure it's defined as skill name and is positioned as second from the top, to make the variable visible on the screen. If that's not the case, then change the number to whatever position the variable is at, inside the text element of the user interface. So in this case, skill name is the global 1 variable. Next, go to the battle subcommands, select execute, add a change switch command, set it to local, and create a new switch and call it skill name toggle, set the value to on. Then add a if else condition, set it to local switch, and select the same switch we made, and set the condition to on. Then add a save value command, and set battle command as source. Set the local variable battle command as unique ID source, and select name as property. Save that value to the global variable skill name. Then select targets, go to execute, add a if else condition, set it to local switch and select the skill name toggle switch and set the condition to be on. Then if the condition is met, use a wait for 100 milliseconds, so it has some time to update the variable before it's being displayed. Add 2 toggle user interface commands and select one for skill name and one for skill name BG and set them to be on. Add one more for portraits and set it to be off. Then add another wait for 2000 milliseconds, that's the time before the skill is being toggled off again. Then add 2 more toggle user interface commands and select skill name and skill name BG and set them to off. After that comes the schedule battle command we had already. Don't change this command, just paste at this position. Then after that add a change switch command and change the local switch skill name toggle to off. And for the else branch paste in the schedule battle command. Next, open up the loaded scripts and add 2 toggle user interface commands, one for skill name and one for skill name BG, and set them to off. So when the battle starts, it will first toggle the visibility of the pane and the text element. Then once we select a skill name toggle will be turned on, and the save value command will save the battle command's name, in that case the skill, to the skill name global variable. Once we then execute the skill on a target, the pane and text element for the skill will toggle on, with a delay of 100 milliseconds, and the portraits will be toggled off. Then it will display the skill for 2 seconds before it toggles off again, schedules the battle commands and turns the skill name toggle switch off. Next, go back to the battle's configuration settings. Now let's finally set a background music. And let's test the battle system. At the end of this video series, we are now able to use all the building blocks and thus plan, design and completely customize any battle system, starting with the building blocks for creating characters, setting up the background and formations, and completely customize it. Designing the user interface for the battle commands, using a powerful scripting language to make the logic for the user interface, creating the skills for the characters, creating the statistics for them, using the animation editor to create our VFX, creating and customizing the actions for all characters, using the UI editor to build any advanced battle overlay, designing our own status effects, and incorporating a wide range of formulas that can be used to even further customize any skill effects and the battle result outcome for all characters, and completely customizing the behavior of the enemies. With all these building blocks we have learned about in this series, we are able to create battle systems similar to Suikoden, Chrono Cross, Breath of Fire, Xenogears, Digimon, Star Ocean, Final Fantasy, Grandia, and so much more. These are just a few battle systems that can be created and completely customized with RPGArchitect, be it with 2D sprites or 3D models, be it on 2D or 3D maps, or be it with images as background and foreground layers. Your imagination is the only limit here. If you want to create a different battle system style, like a first-person or action-based battle system, then you could create those too. If you have familiarized yourself with the given scripting language, then you can make your own unique battle system in any style you want.
Alright, well that should do it for today, architects. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Let Rikyu know down in the comments below how you liked this tutorial. Tell him how awesome it was and thank him immensely for doing this, because it was a big task and he knocked it out, man. So let him know that in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe to the video. If you're not already part of the Discord, join there. There's a link in the description. If you don't have a copy of Architect, then how did you sit through this entire video? Grab your copy on Steam. There's also a link in the description below. We're still in early access as of the recording of this video, so you can get it for half the price of what it'll be when it releases. Thank you guys again so much for all the support. Thank you for watching. I have been Bert, you have been amazing, and we will see you on the next one. Bye bye.
Master Noobk.